I had to talk to my hands, so I'm turning that on. There we go. Perfect. So it's Bruce Calder here, usual. I'm talking about Canada today and talking about the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, Section 71 mandatory surveys. Seems like a big mouthful. It's basically mandatory surveys that come out a couple times a year on chemicals that importers into and manufacturers in Canada have to report to. So I'm going to talk about a lot of the details. Now, things in Canada, we generally, like the United States actually, for the most part, don't restrict things that hurt humans. If it hurts a human, cancer, reproductive harm, cause attention deficit, Alzheimer's, we don't regulate it. If it affects flora and fauna, trees and fishes, we generally do on the environmental side. So most regulated substances today in Canada are persistent organic pollutants. To get to that point or regulation, there's a number of stages, mandatory stages I'll talk about, where they're looking at chemicals and where they're used, and I'll explain all of that. So this is a survey of chemicals that goes to each company. It's a mandatory completion, a little bit technical, and I'll explain the whole thing. So we're going to talk about the Canadian Chemical Management Plan and CEPA process in general, and this particular, they call it a notice, this particular requirement, and its mandatory nature. I'm going to go into the scope, a little bit about the 152 substances in it, the challenges, the highly technical nature, the large scopes of some of them, and the compliance process. So how do you actually do this, and how do we do this? This is often a very specialized task. And for some companies, it can be very limited. You're a consumer retailer, it's quite large. So, and if you sell chemicals, it ends up being generally much larger. So this is a mandatory provision under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA 1999. It's related to certain substances requiring risk information for risk management, which I'll explain. It's mandatory for importers into and manufacturing in Canada. So it's related to this thing. So CEPA is the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. It's a very all-encompassing document. Inside it, chemicals every so often get added to Schedule 1. Now, you might have suppliers ask you, do you have any CEPA Schedule 1 substances? Schedule 1 substances aren't regulated in Canada. All it means if you're on Schedule 1, the chemical has been approved for effort, i.e. money, to be spent to look into whether they should manage the risk of this chemical. It doesn't mean a regulation in of itself. Schedule 1, the toxic substance list, is just a list of substances which have been approved for other reviews and work to be done to see whether or not it should be further regulated or managed. How should they manage the risk provided by the substance? And there's an intermediate section, which is called the Chemical Management Plan, where they work on the risk management measures for a wide range of chemicals. Part of that is the data gathering from industry, mandatory data gathering called Section 71 surveys. It's Section 71 of CEPA. It's a mandatory data survey that companies have to complete. Some of these substances will end up eventually on the restricted list. That's a Canadian prohibition of certain toxic substances. That's the restriction list. The Canadian prohibition is the restricted substance list, not Schedule 1, not this survey. It's the Canadian prohibition. So for right now, that's the short chain chlorinated paraffins. It is a secondary plasticizer. It helps phthalates be more effective inside PVC. And it's banned in Canada. It's also banned in Europe, SCCPs. And by next year, we should start seeing bans on PFOA in physical products, in articles, very similar to the European one. We'll see Dechlorine Plus, which is being banned in Europe. It's another persistent organic pollutant. Again, Canada focuses on chemicals that affect the environment, not human beings. DHP is not being regulated at this point in time outside of children's products. But Dechlorine Plus, a flame retardant that's a bioaccumulant, will be, as will DBDPE. It's a brominated flame retardant, super common in electronics. That's been postponed a bit because the Canadian government has more recently realized how prevalent that chemical is in electronics. So any restrictions in Canadian prohibition, that's a different thing. This is a step before us. We're talking about the data survey that's done to figure out where things are used, to figure out how they're going to manage the risk of those substances, and then what's going to end up in the Canadian prohibition. So a lot of these have gone over the years. Most of you might not have noticed because they're not often in your space. A little bit of flame retardants in 2019. Quaternary ammonium salts in 2018 was pretty timely. That's the main biocide family, like Lysol for COVID and influenza and so on and so forth. So they had a plan on the chemical management plan to send out the survey that came out in June last fall. It didn't go out last fall. This is actually pretty common on the Canadian side. Everything's kind of doesn't make its deadlines. And when it does appear, it's usually Surprise. So the one in spring of this year is supposed to be the PFOA reporting, or the perfluoro PFAS. PFAS hasn't come out yet, maybe end of this year. In 2024, you'll probably have a PFAS reporting requirement in Canada, similar to what Maine and Minnesota is, but it's going to come first. Funnily enough, the Canadian PFAS reporting will probably come before the US European ones, which are 2025 and 2026 or so. This one was supposed to be in the fall. It's actually came out in June, and it's due in January. So this one for last fall, it's a number of substances. I explained. There are 1,550 substances in the third phase of the Canadian Chemical Management Plan. So I think regulatory motto should be for our government, unnecessarily complicated. This is phase 3 of the CMP plan. It's all got acronyms. There are 1,550 substances, which I recognize a lot, but a lot of these substances might not mean a lot to a lot of people. Inside of those, they split them in two, more or less, not best division of two. 852 are in this one. The other 600 or so, or 700 or so will be in the one next year around the same time. So we're doing the first half. The second half will be next year. And it's part of a plan. It's late. I don't think everybody's complaining it's late. I don't think people are looking for more work to do. But it's a 2-year rolling plan. These are all supposed to be done that 2-year plan, which means they really have to get the other ones out next year. So the survey, by the way, whenever you see a hyperlink, it goes somewhere useful. So when you get the slides afterwards, the hyperlinks should generally go somewhere useful. Like that's where the notice is to the survey. Have fun reading it. It's, again, our national motto should be unnecessarily complicated. It's not the easiest read. You're gonna look at what's part 1, how's schedule 1 work? This is so confusing. Also, and I'll explain later, a product is not a product, a physical product like your laptop. A product is a mixture of chemicals. A manufactured item is an article like your laptop. So product means bucket of goo. Manufactured item means physical article. I know it's not going to be easy. Don't worry, I'll repeat this later. So when you're reading, I'm like, I don't understand. It says products have to do that. Yeah, I know products are like cosmetics, like the liquids and powders. Physical items, like your TV screen, are manufactured items. I know. So it's released June 24th. It's due January 17th, 2024. The scope is more complicated, and I'll explain it, but basically we're looking at substances over 0.1% by weight in any component, in a physical product or in mixtures, and over 100 kilograms of the substance, not the product, per year. Plus the article has a bunch of additional criteria. The biggest ones mostly is you're generally looking at products physical products that can be in contact with 14-year-olds or younger. Mixtures don't have that age limitation to the same level. They're more general. There are 852 substances sorted by CAS number, numerically by CAS number. Not an easy read. I'm a ferrochemist. Not the easiest way to present stuff, though alphabetically is not much better, actually. Applies to all companies importing into or manufacturing in Canada if they have substances. Variety of challenges. It's highly technical. It's very chemistry intensive. Most companies, especially in the articles, don't have chemists. Not readily available information, but it is mandatory. So what's normally done is the key one, especially around articles, manufactured items have a lower standard of care. It's about reasonably accessible information. And if you're subject to notice, you're required to provide information that your organization possesses to or which we reasonably expected to have access. So if you have chemicals, they expect you to have safety data sheet and ingredients list, and then expect more out of you. Articles, they expect you to know what's in your product, but they don't expect you to be perfect. So manufactured items, articles have a lower expectation of reasonable accessible information. Now you can ask your suppliers, 852 substances for each supplier, it's going to go miserably badly. Just giving you, there's a better way to do it. So for chemicals, usually the way things are done is you review your SDSs for ingredients. We actually do it a little bit more detailed. We actually look which chemicals we're even worried about, and then even what types of products we're even interested in looking at SDS, and then get the data from the SDS as applicable. And normally, and I'll explain later, in a very refined set of products. We normally don't want to know all your products. Do you sell cosmetics? No. All right. Lubricants? No. Okay, the chemicals in this one probably can't be in your products. Well, there's a few exceptions. There's also, if it would not normally be reportable in a safety data sheet, because there's no hazard, it's also a lower expectation. Physical products like furniture, clothing, medical device, electronics, they expect you to review the scope and applicability of the chemicals to products, identify hazardous products, and find a way to solve it. They say, hey, your supplier should know. No, they won't. You don't know much of anything, really. The PFOA stuff, PFAS stuff is really explaining that. PFOA is in a huge amount of the fluoropolymers right now, but suppliers don't know it because they didn't add it. It's a normal degradation of certain fluoropolymers, not Teflon, but lots of others, into these chemicals. So they're generally not as knowledgeable. We have a better way. So I explain the better way. The key thing off the bat is scope. So there are 4 different sets of chemicals. The rules are actually a little bit different. The least stringent rules is you have to have over 100 kilograms of the chemical, a handful of the substance, actually 1,000, it's 1 ton, 100 kilograms of substance, and it has to be either over 0.1% by concentration of mixtures, so unless it's above 0.1, which is normally the SDS reportable level, it's not in. So it has to be about 0.1 in a mixture, so like a bucket of lubricant or cosmetics or something like that, a chemical. Or for articles, it has to be above 0.1% by weight in a component, and the component has to be intended for children under the age of 14. So your computer, yes, you can use for all ages, but it's also intended for under the age of 14. Or comes in contact with human mucosa. That's mucous membrane. Eyes don't count for some reason. This one, nose, ears, mouth, etc. Or it's cookware, or it's food packaging, or it's bedding, or it's furniture, or it's flooring. So for physical products, unless you have to be cookware, food packaging, bedding, furniture, or flooring, you're really looking for stuff that children can use reasonably. And you're like, well, I have laboratory equipment in the back of the lab, but that's not intended for children. Exactly. Your article won't meet any of those criteria. However, if you sell reagents, those mixtures will. So, and if you're, a consumer retailer, lots of everything here. By the way, if you're not impacted, you still have to submit a non-engagement letter. Or if all importation is through a distributor, the distributor puts a non-engagement letter. So, hey, we have chemical stuff with chemicals in it. Turns out this group, for this reason, and we can help with the justification, doesn't have it in any of my products. So whether you need to actually submit data, I'll show you how to do that. But if you don't have to submit data, you still have to do a non-engagement letter. There's 852 chemicals in this. There's roughly 109 in common usage. However, only 44 could be reasonably found in products. And you're like, how can they be in common usage but not found in products? Dimethyl terephthalate is an example, DMT. It's the terephthalate. By the way, not all phthalates are bad. It's kind of funny. Orthophthalates are generally bad because ortho, by the way, means the arms are on the same side, ortho, and they often degrade into a chemical. It's just like estrogen, affects a decision-making in your brain around the age 1, which causes certain brain cells to commit suicide, reduce the amount of bandwidth or pathways in your brain, and create attention deficit. That's orthophthalate, and that's because the phthalates with the arms on the same side, ortho, degrade in a manner that ends up producing a chemical, looks like estrogen. There is a decision-making in your brain around age 1 related to estrogen. If you screw up that decision-making, it causes some brain cells to kill themselves, commit suicide, called apoptosis. Terephthalate is like pterodactyl. Easy way to remember. Terephthalates are on the opposite side. The arm is the opposite side. Polyester is polyether terephthalate. Terephthalates are harmless. DMT is dimethyl terephthalate. It is the building block of polyester, which is polyester terephthalate. Not all phthalates are bad. However, it's the building block, so huge high volume material to make polyester, because polyester is pretty high volume, but it's not residual in polyester. It's well below the 0.1 level. So it's a high common use chemical that won't be found in your product. And that's why you often end up saying, 109 down to probably around 44 or so. There are a couple that are really common, some examples. Mineral oil, probably one of the most common lubricant additives. By the way, mineral oil that you sell in a bucket or jar is a chemical. Mineral oil inside your engine is part of the article and counted as an article. Kind of weird, eh? So if you sell buckets with lubricant mineral oil, chances are you're going to end up registering or having to submit data. But if mineral oil is in your engine, all that matters is your engine touches 14-year-olds or younger, which seems a bit odd for an engine. Probably not the way it's going to be. So it's quite a different thing. If you have oil lubricating your equipment, quite a bit different than selling buckets of lubricant. They're 2 different classifications, even though it's the exact same chemical. DINP is one of the most common plasticizers for flexible PVC. It's the common replacement for DHP. Now that things are generally ROHS compliant, super common. It'll be 20% of the concentration of flexible PVC. But again, if your power cords are used commonly by children, then you have the exposure. But if they're not, then you don't. So they're very common ones. I make professional equipment for professionals only. Awesome. Chances are you don't have the contact with children. However, do you sell any lubricants or paint separately? Okay, you do. let's look at your volumes, whether you could even possibly declare something. And we're a big fan of doing things in a pretty refined way. So the way a lot of companies do this is they work with a specialized resource. If you don't have one internally, which is pretty common, people come to us. We're probably, risk of declarable chemicals should be complete by August, which we basically have done. So what we do is we first do a risk review of these 852 chemicals. Can any of them even be in products? And then let's look at your products. Could they even be in there? So not really much work for you to do. There is actually extremely simple questionnaire about your uses in products. And then I'll explain that in a bit. And then we can build the data for you. And there's sometimes a couple questions we have for you. Oh, you're saying you have lubricants. What are your main lubricants products? Can we see the safety data sheets, just those main ones? And we can take the data from that and complete your submission. It's not about perfection. It's more orders of magnitude, 1 ton, 10 tons, 100 tons. It's mandatory, but if you don't know it's 1.4 tons versus 1.6 tons, neither will they. We also might need some volume information if you have reportables, and you or your distributor is going to have to do the submission, but it's really easy because we're going to give you a file that you submit. File goes in, you submit, it's great. It should be really simple. We can also web meeting and sit over your shoulders to do it, but it's really straightforward. We'll build the file for you and just drop this Excel file. If you really want to know, we can explain all the complex chemistry and how dimethyl terephthalate becomes polyester, or why this chemical is there, and all the different ways that things do ester or not. And I must say, it doesn't exactly get me invited to many dinner parties, but if you want to, we definitely can. Otherwise, we're just going to put in an Excel file, and you're going to drop it into a box under your name in the government website, and that's that. So there are 4 phases we do. Explain them. Phase 1, there's 852 substances. Are we really worried about all 852? So we first review them to see if there are any. We identify any substance being high volume and has potential being products, which will likely be 100 or 109 or so substances. Then we review the 109 saying, okay, can they really be in physical products? And what do they actually do? Okay, we end up with 50, possibly 44. High risk substances, these can be in products. Sweet, okay, that's where we start. The nice thing is it's a huge amount of work. However, if we do it for so many companies, it ends up being a small amount of work for you. So you got, it's a great way to do it, and a tremendously knowledgeable thing. The other thing is, if we're wrong, everybody's wrong. We're a big fan of hanging together instead of hanging separately. If you're going to be wrong in a good company. Be wrong like everybody else. Because if everybody's wrong, nobody's wrong, which is great. Then we give you a simple questionnaire. It's mostly application. Like, do you have over 1 ton of external red rubber in your products? You're like, that's the weirdest question. No. Okay. That takes off. There's a very specific chemical. It's only in red rubber. Great. Now, some companies are like, yes, we do. Like, do you sell over a ton of sporting goods a year? Yeah. Or I'm like, no. Some are yes. It's because there's a very specific chemical that's really a Delrin, that's really high volume in children contacting in athletic equipment. There are a few other uses. It's good in guitar picks, but there's not the tonnage of guitar picks I'm worried about a trace chemical. It's acetyl, also called polyformaldehyde. So there's a questionnaire, simple. Then we take that and we have a spreadsheet that maps it to all the substances, your answers, and then we come back to an initial list of declarable substances. This is the starting point, which will often be 3 if you're a retailer, 10. So we're at 10, realistically, based on what you sell, the chemicals you might actually have. Now let's look at those 3 or 10 or maybe 1 in detail. Okay, where would it be, these products? Okay, there might be a specific question for your main supplier of that product. Do you use this UV stabilizer in this material? No? Okay. Or they don't know, we can test for it easily. It's included in the project because often it's easier to test for things cheaper than supplier work. Or it's basic, okay, you say it's in you sell baby oil, it'll have mineral oil. What's your highest volume baby oil products? These 2. All right. Okay, let's look at your safety data sheets, 50% of each. What's your annual volume, more or less? Perfect. We can do concentration, usage of volume, etc. Create the submission, and that is everything we need. So it might need a little help from you if you have some high-risk substances, but it's not like you're going to ask every supplier for 852 chemicals. It'll likely be a specific small number of suppliers, if that, for very specific chemical for a very specific situation. It's not your product. It's like that plastic right there. Once you have it, and you're like, well, I have a huge range of products. It's funny, often because it's close enough. You look at the highest volume ones of the situation, and if they don't have it, it's pretty justifiable. The other ones won't either, or won't have enough volume. So that's where you look at it. And eventually, we create declaration information from that, which we might have Some of those high-risk declarable subs might have dropped off the list because once we did the math or inquired about it, it's not really there. It could be there, but it's not right now. Or in the ones you sell. Awesome. And we create the declarable information. Then there's some outputs. We either put it in an Excel file, which is what gets submitted to the government. It's really easy. We fill in the columns. Columns are a bit complicated, but we just fill them in for you. We'll explain what they are if you're really interested and show you what they are. But really, all you have to do is take it, drop it you log into the Canadian system for your company, drop in the file, and you're done. Now, if you don't have a declarable, we'll also write the non-engagement letter for you. It's pretty simple, but we also write, no matter what, a justification document, which is a big, massive thing. But it doesn't cost like a big, massive thing because we do the same basic justification. Most of the chemicals are justified why you don't have it for the exact same reason. This is why you don't have these things. So if anybody asks whether you've done the right work or due diligence, you're like, this is why we did it. And they're like, okay. And so it gives you a basis for non-engagement or why you declared some things and not others. And it turns out there's a mistake later, which is never impossible because 852 substances, and you might sell a lot of complicated things. There's no penalty for it. And then you have to submit the file because it's under your name, or if it's all done by an importer, distributor, then they have to submit, but you just give them the file. When in doubt, if somebody doesn't know how to do it, which is not unreasonable, we have a web meeting and you submit it with us looking over your shoulder. Just makes your life a lot easier. But it's really easy. We just solve it. You go and ask all your suppliers about it. It is going to be awful. It's 852 substances numerically by CAS. Reach is hard. No reach justification is hard enough, and it's only 200 something. And they're pretty well understood substances. This one's a bit complicated. So again, the survey, this one, this will be about 2 a year, released June 24th, 2023. You're going to have to get used to doing this. The next one's PFAS. Due January 2024. PFAS probably later 2024. It's a mandatory completion if you have any of the substances above 0.1% by weight in articles or mixtures and over 100 kilograms per year. And if your article, you're really looking, other than food contacting, a few other things, you're mostly looking at it, can it be used by a 14-year-old or younger? Mixtures don't have that. Mixtures is above 0.1% and is the substance over 100 kilograms per year. There are 852 substances by CAS number. They're also broke up in 4 different parts. It's a tough sledding and applies to all companies importing into or manufacturing in Canada. So again, it has to be done. It's really complicated to do. We can make it easier. Again, for the scope, it's 852 chemicals. There are some that are 1,000 kilograms per substance, but most has to be over 100 kilograms of substance. It has to be in a mixture above 0.1% by weight or in over 0.1% by weight of a component. That means one of, not all of them. That'd be something. You'd be children's nose contacting, cookware, food packaging, bedding. That'd be awesome. Food packaging, bedding. That'd be something. Furniture, flooring. No, it's one of those. That'd be one really interesting product. And it has to be in a component about 0.1%, and the substance over 100 kilograms a year. So if you sell computers and such, DINPs in power cables, and your computers can be used by somebody 14 or younger, definitely can be above that level. Your laboratory equipment in the back of a lab, there's no children involved at all. Especially when our labor age, by the way, here is you can work at age 14, but you're not allowed to work in a lab setting or you can't cook in a restaurant. A lot of people don't really realize that until you're 15. 14, you can work the front office, you can work a paperwork job, you can work cash, but you can't work in the lab or in a chemical lab or in like in a restaurant. You can't cook. Turns out. It's just funny, a lot of the youngest people get put into cooking, they're not allowed to. It's labor law here. So it makes it a lot easier. Professional products, 14 is kind of a big age. If not impacted, a non-engagement letter is still required. So if you don't end up not doing anything, awesome, you still have to put the non-engagement letter and a reasonable justification why you don't have to do anything, which is pretty easy. So normally we do the work. If you're generally not impacted, it's a lot less expensive. And here's the justification document and the non-engagement letter referring to the justification, and you're good to go until the next one comes around. PFAS will be kicking around probably within 6 to 9 months. So it's a relatively shorter one today. Try not to complicate your life. I mean, this stuff is super complicated. I can explain every single one of the chemicals to you, and it's not very exciting. And you'll kind of keep saying, like, we keep hearing the word methyl a lot. I'm like, yeah, it's the building block. One of the simple mnemonics I use all the time is monkeys eat peanut butter. Methyl is 1 carbon, ethyl is 2, propyl is 3 carbons, a butyl is 4. Monkeys eat peanut butter. Easy way to keep track of how long the chain is. 1, 2, 3, 4. Methyl ethyl propyl butyl. Monkeys eat peanut butter. But for most people, like, that's not very useful. I'm like, I know. You go home and tell, hey, look, I got a great mnemonic about chemistry. Monkeys eat peanut butter. Awesome. What does it mean? It means how long carbon molecules are. They're like, why are you even telling me this? So it is more useful in my life. And you ever feel like, seeing what every single substance is. By the way, when we do it, we'll actually list why every substance is or is not in your product. And the nice thing about it, the reason it's not in your product, it's the same reason usually it's not in someone else's product. So it's not like we're not custom knitting. I'm not a big fan of custom knitting solutions. I like the good solution that's been done 50 times, and it's been done the same way, and it's been reviewed to heck and works, and it's the same as everybody else's. So if it's wrong, everybody's wrong, because human error does exist, especially when you have hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. So it's just a lot safer. So upcoming webinars, by the way, really, really cool one coming up. It's on PFAS, where we're finding in products, much more updated data, exactly where it is and why in products, and why electronics have like 10 to 20 more PFAS parts than your cookware does, so on and so forth. Why almost everybody right now reading this will be wearing a PFAS. They just don't know it. They're like, I'm not wearing a waterproof jacket. Haha, it's funny. See if I have it on this one. Of course I won't. No, I don't. That's a cheap one. Oh, there it goes. There's a better one. So that little white tag, I know it's kind of a weirdest photo. Hopefully somebody can Photoshop this one. Right there. It's the washing instructions and where it was made. It's fluoroacrylate coated. It's actually fluoro-coated usually. It's one of the most common places we find fluoros. It's fluoro-coated, so it's indelible, and the washing instructions or the made in whatever country don't go away. So it's funny. It'll have PFOA in it for sure. Fluoroacrylates break down to PFOA really easily. Teflon does not. Fluoroacrylates do. It's a very different material than Teflon. And you're bleaching your skin, but it's low concentration. It'll be fine. It's not your laundry detergent. The laundry detergent used to clean your clothes is much higher concentration, and it does more or less the same thing, just kind of weakly. But yeah, it's super, super common. So where do we find them like that? It's awesome. People's like, oh, PFAS is horrible. Awesome. Do you have the little tag with the washing instructions in your shirt? Ooh, yeah. Actually, the most common source of PFAS in water supply for the longest time, until about a year and a half ago, was foundation and concealer. It was one of the main ingredients in it, actually. Washes right down into the water systems where most of it was coming from in the water. People are applying it to their face and body. And compared to the tiny, tiny little bit in the tag of the washing instructions of your shirt, it's pretty well nothing. It's kind of funny in terms of Teflon. We work with lots of restricted materials. Aluminum is quite a dangerous material, not in itself, but the dissolved form of aluminum kills brain cells, especially after age 50. It's a game, by the way, of how well your kidneys remove aluminum from their system versus how fast you heal. There's a certain time in life where your kidneys are not purging enough aluminum, and it's starting to do brain damage, and you're not healing as fast as you used to. And once the damage gets done faster than you can heal, and that's why you have this slow onset of Alzheimer's. And by the time they identify it, it's too far along. So we use, at home, we don't use aluminum foil, because aluminum foil breaks down in vinegar pretty bloody easy. If you want to see how to get a super dosage of Alzheimer's chemical, put vinegar in aluminum foil. It's really easy to measure. You probably don't have a lab. We do. It's pretty easy to measure. So I use actually Teflon. Same thing. It's much, much safer. You're like, wait a second. It's not what I know. It's complicated. Teflon is much safer. Not all PFAS are Teflon. Everybody blames cookware for this, that, and the other thing. Cookware is not responsible for pretty well any of the stuff that's in drinking water. Actually, none of it. It's completely other chemicals. And it's mostly not the tag in the back either. So we're doing a wonderful presentation August 30th. We'll learn things about the world. It'll be neat, and also the regulation stuff. But where are we actually finding this? So we have thousands and thousands and thousands of test data now where things are at and where it is. And then for those companies who are in our PFAS submission project, basically Europe is banning all PFAS unless companies submit why they need it. We're doing this incredibly detailed submission, both on technical, like all the different alternatives and what is good and what is bad, why silicone. By the way, this is kind of neat. Silicone rubber, if you have in your product, is probably going to be banned before Teflon is. I know, it might be a bit shocking. Wait a minute, isn't silicone replacement from PTFE? No, it's actually a pretty awful substance for replacement. It can't do that. But it's much more likely to be banned before the PFAS because they're banning one of the three of the main ingredients in it. And that's become a pop substance. It's going through right now. So we'll see how that all goes. But we'll talk about that. The submission project for only members of the project, it is fantastic. people might be saying, hey, other people are taking care of my uses. You know what? It's funny. They're taking care, they're creating verbiage which covers their uses, but it's surprising how many companies out there, your use isn't in there. When the actual exemption derogation comes out, you're probably going to be excluded because the verbiage doesn't quite include the way you use it. PFAS, especially the fluoropolymers, have a wide range of uses. And companies are definitely using verbiage around what application they use. Your application may not be 100% the same. So definitely worthwhile. It's only one cost to the entire company, no matter how big you are. It's really, really good. You can keep speed on everything. It's at a technical level because we have our lab that nobody else can match. Any of your industry associations can't match. The funny thing is, if you're part of an industry association doing somewhat the same thing for your per industry, there's never a bad thing to have a backup plan. Having two different ways to protect yourself, great idea. I mean, why only take one swing? Why not take two swings? It's fair. Ours is application based. So we're not like looking at medical devices or oil and gas. We're actually looking at, you need the Viton seal for situations where you need this chemical resistance, which by the way includes some consumer applications too. Quite useful, very, very important. As I go through the different materials, you'd be amazed what some of the common materials you use or have don't survive. They can't do certain things. There's a reason for it. But this is for participants only. It's September 6th. I definitely recommend people joining the program. You will learn a tremendous amount. You'll also be able to make sure that your use of PFAS are continued for another 7 or 14 years or similar. And for those in the project, we'll be sending out a link next week. Don't be left out. And obviously, we do the service, and there's lots of good ways to pull you in. You get the benefit for a very limited cost of what everybody knows, and you get to protect your product. Otherwise, if the right derogations don't get through, you can redesigning most of what you make. Don't worry about the cookware. Cookware have maybe one PFAS part. Your electronics has on average 20 inside of it, a lot. And they're for a huge number of reasons. The fluoropolymers have a tremendous uses for so many high temperature and dielectric reasons. And high temperature, especially for dense electronics, is a very important use. So September 6th for participants only. For the project, not product. We're gonna fix that. Projects, participants only. Also, of course, if you want to know what's in your PFAS, we are the best by a mile. We have the best, simplest, fastest, least expensive. So you get the most for least money way to test for fluoros in your products. People might say, hey, there are thousands of PFAS. I'm like, yes, there is and there isn't. Fluoropolymers are a very small number of cast number, and all intentional PFAS are really governed by, they'll be there over 100 parts per million fluorine. We tested 50, but they'll be over 100 parts per million fluorine. The PFOA family, the residuals that generally are not there on purpose, they're degradation. There's a handful of fundamentals. Anything degrades into a handful of fundamentals. There's a whole reason for it. And in the one on August 30th, I can explain the fundamentals concept so for example, Viton, very common fluoroelastomer, has a surfactant. It's usually I'll use a name brand. It's Chemmore's Capstone, but that type, it's a 6 carbon fluorine chain with 2 carbon hydrogen photopolymer, sulfur, and then a bunch of other stuff. That bunch of other stuff falls off, as does slowly the photopolymer part, and you always end up with the 4, 5, 6, or 7 length version of PFOA. So it's always there. You might have the others, but if you're using that chemical, you'll always get some of the PFOA family. And by testing for those fundamentals, you can detect whether it's there. It's really a much easier way to do it. Cheaper, faster, much more accurate. Testing all the time helps a lot. We know a lot of what's going on. So we have a first service talking about today. There's a web page link. There's links in here. Go to our page. Another only 146 days or so before you have to do this or submit it. We can help. Some companies are, of course, much lower impacted, so the cost of working with is much lower because a lot of this is justifying why you don't have to do anything. Recommendations, again, use a specialized resource. We can do most of the work for you, especially when we don't have to do that much custom work, where a lot of the work is really, a tremendous amount of work is really proving why you don't have to do anything. Proving why you don't have to do something or why something doesn't exist is much harder than proving something does exist. Proving that mineral oil is in baby oil is pretty easy because it's blatantly obvious in the ingredients and the safety data sheet. Proving that a chemical isn't in a product because it's never used for that is more complicated. So we have to do a more complicated review. It would be a huge thing, except we do so much of it for so many companies. It's the same thing, 90% the same thing for everybody, and then we refine the last 10% for you. So really, really good. If you have any questions, feel free to submit it in the control panel. Everybody will receive a copy of these slides after I make that one text mistake, product versus project. There will be a recording probably available by the end of the week. It'll be a bit slower, so I make a little more sense, maybe, so on and so forth. Okay, question. The requirement for over 0.1% of the article mixture, does this application article apply to the same as ROHS, where it's 0.1% of the material, or it's physically or homogeneous or not? Canada doesn't define it. However, they use a term that's very similar to other import terms like Europe. What's an article? So we use the European article. It's at the component level. So not homogeneous, at the component level. In the end of the day, it usually doesn't make much math difference. It's at the component level for articles. Well, server be considered a product and article. The components in a server are articles. Like the frame, the housing, the connector, but the outside, the inside, unless you make like a robot to be assembled by children, where they work the inside electronics, it's only the outside. It's only the stuff the children can touch. Or if you make electronics that are bedding, like a heated blanket, that would be one too. But products are chemicals. Manufactured items are articles, and they're the components that, in most cases, in this particular one, by the way, every single section 71 is different, is children 14 or under 14 with touch. Do you need to report if a list of chemicals contained inside a product but not exposed? No. If it doesn't have the 14-year-old reasonably intended, then it doesn't have to. And it's reasonably intended, saying basically, yes, they could open up and touch the circuit board, but we don't tell them to do that, so don't. What is the ballpark cost for Claigan to do the product article survey? It depends a little bit. Just contact us. It's basically, if you have no chemicals, it's a lot cheaper. If you're a professional only, it's a lot cheaper. It's in the couple $1,000s range. If you're really low, it's less than that. If you're a full retailer, it's with consumer and stuff, it's much higher than that. But because they have chemical in an article. But physical products, we're talking not that much at all. Is submission by all distributor importers or a single submission by a producer be sufficient? Yes, you can submit for multi-sites or multi-entities. There is a multi-submission. You basically say, hey, we're submitting to this company. It also covers all this. And they get picky. You can fix it later, but there's basically a multi-location submission. We're saying, I'm submitting for all of these people or locations. If your article is not intended for children under 14-year-old, then are those articles exempt? Yes. So you're looking at mixtures. So some of you might be, I'm just doing a non-engagement letter saying none of my products. Yep. And in that case, that's really inexpensive. We can do it for you, or you can review yours, but that's just a couple, hour or two of consulting. So that's not too bad. Sorry if I was late. If applicable, would importers in Canada receive the survey from some kind of Canadian entity? Yes, sometimes. So if you've done other ones, you'll normally receive it, but it'll be the contact person did last time, whoever's the contact in the system. And they'll send it to the contact under certain tariff codes in customs, and they're guessing from then on. But the way the law is structured is they don't have to ask you, you have to do it. If they ask you, obviously you're more likely to be bothered. Enforcement is more likely to be present. If nobody asks you and you don't do it, they might not. Enforcement's less likely because they don't know you exist, but you still have to. But if they've notified a Canadian entity, then they definitely are going to end up having to do it because they're going to follow up with you. What government website is used for the submission? I'm just going to click a couple times here. There we go. There is a link to the files there. The Excel and the non-engagement letter files, which are actually the same page, will give you where everything is. And then it'll explain, it's got a long, again, unnecessarily complicated name and unnecessarily complicated way to register the first time as a company, but it's all there. The product's intended primarily for adults, but could be used for 14-year-olds. Wristwatch. Will these normally come in scope? Yeah, so like a computer, if it's intended, so basically you're saying, hey, this product's for age 16 or above, or professional users, no. But if you're selling and it could be, it's not necessarily explicitly them, but it could be, then yes. Are there any companies, exemptions requirement, companies under 10 employees? Just thinking about that earlier, I believe, but it's tiny. So even as a laboratory, we often have to report if we go over the volumes. But at 100 kilograms, you're talking of a chemical, you're talking usually reasonable volumes of the product. Now, that doesn't mean a distributor, one person gets around bringing in everything from, all the appliances from, say, General Electric or something like that. You can't do that. So it is really based on the volume. So if you're really small, you don't have the volume. But even if we're increasing a large lab, but even some of the smaller labs we work with, I had to report time to time because we bring in sometimes chemicals we need in a reasonable volume. Do business-to-business computer products follow a scope because not intended to come in contact with children? Yes. You might still have to do a non-engagement letter, but yes. Perfect. That's it for questions. If you think of anything else, feel free to reach out. It is very technical. A lot of people on this call, your scope effect is mostly explained why you don't have to do anything. There will be some that have some. If you have chemicals, especially on the laboratory side, the consumer side, consumer have a lot more. Cosmetics makes up probably about 20% of the applicable substances. And lubricants, between cosmetics and lubricants, you're looking at about 40% of the potentially declarable ones. So, 15 to 20. Take those two out, you're looking at a handful of things, but mineral oil and DINP are pretty prevalent. Of course, if DINP, which is in most power cables, not all, they're not intended for 14 or under 14, but they're not likely to use it, then not really a big deal. Perfect. Well, thanks much. Again, everybody should receive copies. We have a whole bunch of webinars coming up. The one on the 30th is for everybody. It's going to be really cool. The one on the 6th is going to be absolutely superb. It's only for members of the project, not product. Definitely worthwhile joining. Definitely the EPA has reached out. They want the files that are coming out of this. Also, they're going to the European. They are phenomenal. The Canadian government has actually recently asked us for them. They're going to have lots of what the replacements are like, why most of them don't work. They're very explicit. Why most of the PFAS are pretty safe, but a handful are not, and what uses they have, and then all the derogations, all the exemptions they require for industry to function still, and not hurt people. If you remove PFAS, you're going to hurt a lot of people. There's a lot of really important uses of them that keep people safe and unharmed. Well, thanks muchly, everybody, and a pleasure talking to everyone, and I hope forward to talking to everyone again soon.